Hi there, this is Doug Zanes. Welcome to my weekly show. I appreciate you tuning in today. For those of you who have listened to me before, you know that I'm a personal injury attorney. I have a personal injury law firm with offices in both Tucson and Phoenix, Arizona. We're one of the biggest injury law firms in the state of Arizona. And I do this show each week, to talk about different legal topics and provide general information to anybody out there who has an interest in it. So I wanted to I'd like to thank you for tuning in today. Today I want to talk a little bit about personal injury cases in general. I think most of you all are familiar with car accident claims. You're familiar with slip and fall claims, dog bite claims, the normal, basic, everyday type claims. But we here at Zanes Law, quite honestly, although we handle all those claims and we do thousands of those claims every year, we also handle a variety of other types of injury claims. And I think it's important that everybody kind of think about those because they could apply to somebody who's listening to this. One area of practice that we handle cases in is called class action and mass tort cases. And generally, I think there's people can mistakenly lump those together as one single type of case, and although they're similar, they are different. And so I'll explain it to you this way: a class action case actually sort of falls under mass torts in general. And what a class action case is a class action case is generally made up of the type of injury, the type of case where somebody has kind of suffered some sort of damage for one reason or another. But the individual case really isn't big enough to justify bringing an individual case all by yourself. But because of what's happened, because of what somebody's done, there are also lots of other people who have suffered that same harm. And so what happens in a class action case is you will bring all those claimants together in a single case that now justifies bringing that case forward, the overall case value for everybody involved. And it may be hundreds of people to thousands of people, generally, somewhere in that range. And different types of, and so generally what you have is you have claimants, who have a common dispute between all of them, and all of them have been affected, and there's so many of them, it makes more sense to bring them as a group as opposed to individually. And in a lot of class action type cases, bringing an individual claim wouldn't be, like I had said, financially wouldn't make financial sense because of the value of that single case. And so there are certain different types of class action cases. One type involves employees. If employees are subject to patterns or practices by a certain company of discrimination, either because of race, age, or gender, by an employer, and you have a big enough employer, so you have enough people that are affected to bring a bigger case. Maybe a company has failed to pay overtime, and so that can be brought as a class action case for all the employers who are affected, even though it wouldn't make sense for one employee to sue over the $300 that they failed to receive. But when you have 1,000 of them, it may make sense to bring that case as a class action. You have environmental disasters, let's say like the BP oil spill that took place a few years back in the Gulf of Mexico. You have manipulative business practices that may only affect an individual to a small amount. Let's say a fee that shouldn't be charged is being charged on your phone bill, and it's cost you a couple $100 that they've essentially taken from you that they shouldn't. it doesn't make sense for you to bring that claim individually, but if it's affected, thousands, now it makes sense to bring a class action claim for everybody. Securities fraud also falls into this. So that's a class action claim. Now, mass tort is similar to that, but a mass tort claim tends to involve defective products or defective drugs and medical devices. And what happens with mass tort cases is, in general, individuals typically have individual harm much greater than a lot of those involved in class actions. And I think mass tort cases tend to involve significantly greater numbers of individuals. Instead of hundreds or maybe thousands, mass torts tend to involve tens of thousands of claimants. Those tens of thousands of claimants typically are spread across the country, as opposed to, let's say, just in one city or one kind of smaller geographic area. And so that's how mass tort cases tend to be different. And so you handle them differently. I mean, class action cases are typically normal cases from a legal perspective, from a complexity perspective. They just involve more than one person. Mass tort cases can be very, very complex. And so they need to be handled much differently than a class action case. And so those are the two differences. Here at Zanes Law, we handle both types of cases. Really what happens in a lot of instances is we'll get an individual client who calls us regarding an issue or a problem, and as we begin to investigate, their injury, their case, that's what leads us to the bigger case, the mass tort case or the class action case. In particular with class action cases, with mass tort cases, we generally know ahead of time, what the issue is, what the defective product is or the problem is, and then we can go and put that information out to the world, and anybody who's been affected, can see our advertising or find it on our website and then come and hire us. And those mass tort cases tend to move forward a little differently. Great example of a class action case in comparison to a mass tort case. It's, when I'm recording this, is actually May 7th of 2015. This past weekend, there was a big boxing match. It was the Floyd Mayweather-Manny Pacquiao boxing match in Las Vegas. That fight occurred on Saturday. I think by Monday or Tuesday, two different law firms, one in Nevada and one in Los Angeles, had filed class action lawsuits against the fighters and the promoters. And the basis for it was essentially, for lack of a better way to put it, fraud or a manipulative business practices type argument, which was, the argument was this: Manny Pacquiao allegedly hurt his shoulder in the weeks prior to the fight, and that information was kept secret. Fight occurred. People paid money to buy tickets to the fight. People went and bet on the fight, not having that information. And now those people have said, you essentially took our money and you shouldn't have. Had we known that, we wouldn't have bought tickets to the fight. Had we known that, we would have placed a different bet. And so now you need to pay us, back. Let's say it's our ticket price. So individually, the price of that ticket may not be worth pursuing the litigation. But if you take the, let's say hundreds of people who saw the fight and lump them into a class, now the case is worth bringing. And the value of that case, I think, one of the claims has been, has essentially positioned it as about a $5 million claim. That's a class action claim. In comparison is a mass tort claim. One mass tort claim that's occurred, in recent years has been the Vioxx, medication claim, where the argument was Vioxx was a dangerous drug. It should have never been put on the market. The pharmaceutical company knew it. It caused huge injuries, even killed people. And a Vioxx mass tort case was put together that didn't involve one law firm or a couple law firms, bringing a class action representing a small group of people. It involved hundreds of attorneys across the country with tens of thousands of clients who were bringing claims. And instead of the value of the claim being, let's say, $5 million, it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, when it was all said and done. Those are the differences, in the grand scheme of things. Another type of case that we handle here at Zanes Law is construction accident cases. Construction accident cases are pretty straightforward. I mean, it's any type of accident that happens on a job site, on a construction site. And construction accident cases tend to be very complex because what happens is you have lots of different parties who can be involved and be responsible. Because generally on a construction site, you have a general contractor who's responsible for the entire job site. But then you have a bunch of subcontractors, whether it's the plumbing subcontractor or the electrical subcontractor or the paving subcontractor, and that goes on for just about every type of work that needs to be done on the job site. So if somebody is on the job site and gets hurt, and they are hurt because of the negligence of another party on the law who's on the job site, they have an injury claim for negligence. Now, if they get hurt because they just get hurt, let's say they, just happened to, let's say you have somebody working for the plumbing subcontractor who gets hurt on the job site, and he's hurt because of the negligence of one of his coworkers who also works for the plumbing subcontractor. That's a workers' compensation case. It's not a personal injury case. If that same person who gets hurt is hurt by, let's say, somebody who works for the paving subcontractor, that person now has a personal injury claim against the paving company. Now, whenever anybody gets hurt on the job site, they will most likely have a workers' compensation claim, but there's a very good chance they have a second claim that's a personal injury claim against either a different subcontractor or against the general contractor because of their failure to provide a safe work site. Anytime you or somebody has been hurt on a construction site, you really need to talk to a personal injury attorney who can look at all aspects of the claim and tell you whether or not you actually have a personal injury claim in addition to your workers' compensation claim. We also handle nursing home abuse cases. Nursing home abuse cases are very, very complicated cases. And the best way to look at them is this. Nursing home abuse is also elder abuse. Again, not everybody in a nursing home is elderly. You have people who end up, unfortunately, in nursing homes because they've been injured so severely and they need round-the-clock care. So you can have non-elderly people who have a nursing home abuse case. But a significant number of abuse cases involve elderly patients who are in nursing homes or really any care facility. And you want to look at three different kinds. I mean, there's physical abuse, and that, it's quite frankly when somebody who is an employee at the facility physically abuses your loved one. They hit them. They, push them around. They, do things. There are 1,000 different ways to physically abuse something, and that's what's happening to your loved one. Physical abuse is generally easier to spot because you'll see wounds, you'll see cuts, you'll see bruises, you'll see welts or discolorations. Sometimes you see broken bones. And if you see any of these things and the facility can't give you an explanation that you find to be an acceptable explanation as to how this injury occurred, you really ought to give us a call and let us look at the case, and at least sit down and talk to us about what's happened and how it's happened. There's also emotional abuse within care facilities, you know, and especially if you're dealing with people whose mental capacity has been diminished because of an injury or elderly patients. And some signs to watch for are, just your loved one acting, unusually upset or, extremely agitated or withdrawn, not really being as communicative as they usually are. If you see somebody actually posturing in a protective way, if you see if somebody who works in the facility comes into the room and, your loved one flinches, all of those things are signs of abuse, whether it's physical, whether it's emotional. So you really want to, keep an eye on those things. And then there's simply neglect, and that's a huge part of nursing home abuse cases, deals with neglect, failure to provide the appropriate care. That can be difficult to determine, but you want to look at things like, is your loved one losing weight? Are they becoming, listless? It's possible that they're not getting the nourishment that they need, that they're not receiving, they're not being fed the way that they should be. It's possible that they're not being hydrated the way that they should be. If you see dry, cracked lips and cracked skin, that's an indicator that they're not being hydrated the way that they should be. And you also want to look at, for example, is your loved one being changed the way they should be? Is there, I don't know if they've got to have a diaper. Is that being changed and dealt with appropriately? When patients have things like bed sores, that tends to be an indicator of neglect. They're not receiving the appropriate treatment that they should be. All those are things that you want to watch for. And if you see them, you really ought to talk to us. Give us a call. We're happy to sit down and listen, go through it all, and investigate the case. Because, you're the only one who can protect your loved ones who are in care facilities like nursing homes. We also handle burn injuries. Burn injuries can be significant. Burn injuries can be horrific. And there are lots of different types. There's scalding, being burned from hot liquid. For example, let's say a hot tub at a hotel hasn't been, maintained properly. There have been cases where, for example, somebody jumps into that hot tub and instead of being the temperature that it should be, let's say 100 degrees, it's actually much hotter. And, they receive horrific burns from that. Anything like that, that deals with hot tubs, showers, all of those things, basically water that's just way too hot, hotter than it should be, or any type of liquid. There's, clothing that's flammable that shouldn't be, whether it's Halloween costumes, or anything else. There is defective products that catch on fire, that should never catch on fire, that cause burn injuries. You have contact burns from, let's say, electronic equipment that could create a personal injury case because of the burn. House fires. You get back to, well, how'd the fire start? Was something not maintained the way that it should have? Did the gas company do something that they shouldn't have done or not maintain something that caused a gas explosion? Burn injuries can come from, hundreds of different things. We have a current case right now that involves a young person who at school was allowed to use the microwave without any supervision, heated soup up much hotter than it should have been, and again, there wasn't any supervision. She took it back to the table, and another one of the elementary school kids spilled the soup on her, and she received pretty horrible burns. That's an example of a burn injury case where somebody may not necessarily realize that I've got a negligence case against somebody else who's responsible for that. So keep those things in mind. We also handle dog bite cases, which I think a lot of people know about it, but a couple things to keep in mind. With dog bite cases, you have a 1-year statute of limitations in Arizona when it comes to strict liability. You still have a 2-year statute of limitations when it comes to a negligence claim, but lots of states will give you the opportunity to bring a strict liability claim with a dog bite. And what that means is you don't have to prove that the owner was negligent. You just have to prove that they own the dog and the dog bit you and they're responsible. And so the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges with dog bite cases is finding insurance coverage that will compensate our clients, either because a dog owner doesn't have insurance coverage or because the insurance carrier wants to claim that that particular dog wasn't covered, or that dog, that event wasn't covered under their policy. But if you know anybody who's been bitten by a dog, we'd be happy to talk to them, and you certainly ought to seek the assistance of an injury lawyer. We handle workers' compensation cases. We talked about that a little bit, or touched on it a little bit when we talked about construction accidents, but really a workers' compensation case is when anybody is injured at work. You've got a workers' compensation case. In Arizona, it's completely no fault, so that means if you've been hurt at work, you have a claim that you can bring, and, again, you're dealing with a workers' compensation insurance company, and their goal is to pay you as little as possible, so you really ought to seek the help of an attorney who handles workers' compensation cases. And then we also handle general insurance cases. What a general insurance case is that's any case involving an insurance company who refuses to honor a claim that they should honor. You see it a lot with natural disasters when somebody's home is destroyed and an insurance carrier tries to argue, well, the home was destroyed because of floodwaters, not because of wind, and because the homeowner's coverage doesn't cover flood, they don't have to replace your home. Those types of arguments. And so you see it a lot with natural disasters. But any claim that involves kind of an insurance company not providing the coverage that contractually they should cover, we'll look at those cases and take them if it's a case that we think we can be successful on and help our client with. That's about all I wanted to talk about today. I hope that was helpful to all you guys. Until next week, have a great week.